Mellow greetings, everybody. My name is James. I am from the internet, and today we are going to talk about church, and more importantly, the grift involved around it. Now, before anybody gets freaked out, I grew up in the church. My earliest memories are of being a child with my nicest little health tech's outfit on, and my grandmother giving me 2 quarters before I'd go walk off to church, and instructions to put one in the little electronic candle thing up front. Where I would then say a prayer for Uncle Larry and his cancer, and then I would save the other quarter and give it to the collection plate that came by, and I'd spend 2 hours, singing the songs I'm taught and reading the things in the book that I'm told to read, and noticing that I was surrounded by enormous marble statues of old dudes with their dicks out. Whole thing was just kind of confusing to me, but I grew up in the church. I get it. Now, these days, I'm not so much a fan of large-scale hierarchical institutions because, of course, they breed fraud and all sorts of other problems. Of course, the Catholic Church, probably pretty happy where it's situated at. Now, since there's a whole bunch of stories brewing in the background about churches and money and all the shenanigans that have been going on this year, I thought we would revisit what this looks like, take a look at some of the newer information and data, and then the story du jour about the church du jour that is doing the theft du jour. So, buckle up, du jours, here we go. Catholic Church lobbied for taxpayer funds, got $1.4 billion. Now, we covered this much earlier this year. Once they started rolling out the PPP loans, invariably the grift was on. It was the race to see what group, what organization, what corporation, what industry could literally siphon the most money out of that fund before any normal human beings that were small business owners could get even a little bit of money to help get through the lean times. U.S. Roman Catholic Church used a special unprecedented tax exemption from federal rules to amass at least $1.4 billion in taxpayer-backed coronavirus aid, with many millions going to dioceses that have paid huge settlements or sought bankruptcy protection because of clergy's sexual abuse cover-ups. Right about now, you're going, oh yeah, I remember this. The church's haul may have reached or even exceeded $3.5 billion, making a global religious institution with more than 1 billion followers among the biggest winners in the U.S. government pandemic relief efforts. Houses of worship and faith-based organizations that promote religious beliefs aren't usually eligible for money from the U.S. Small Business Administration, but as the economy plummeted and jobless rates soared, Congress let faith groups and other nonprofits tap into the Paycheck Protection Program, a $659 billion fund created to keep Main Street open and Americans employed. And just so we're all clear, anytime that you hear the government approved a fund that other people are, going to all come into and take parts of, you can be rest assured that there's a bunch of old, fat, rich white dudes who are going to take off all their clothes and just jump into this giant pool of money like it's gold coins at Scrooge McDuck's house, and they're just, woohoo! And then they're going to get out of the pool, and whatever happens to stick to them, sticks to them. But the rest is for y'all. Now that we're all caught up on the PPP and what the early estimates were of the Catholic Church grift, I want to remind you of the long-standing Catholic Church grift that has been going on for hundreds of years before we return to today. Churches have been exempt from paying property taxes since the colonial days, a tradition inspired by medieval English law. In 1864, U.S. churches were officially lumped in with charitable organizations, exempting them from income tax as well. The Internal Revenue Service grants all churches a 501c3 status like all other U.S. nonprofits. In addition to property and income tax exemptions, taxpayers subsidize clergy housing and perks like free parking, so they are literally running tax negative. There have been a few voices of protest about the exemption over the years, but nothing major. Quote, usually it's local politicians that say, let's go tax churches, and then the issue disappears. It never goes to major public debate, it never goes into a national TV debate, or to the candidates for presidency. They don't touch it because they don't want to lose votes. For a pearl-clutching atheist, the tax revenue churches receive is staggering. In New York in 2019 alone, churches lined their coffers with at least $756.2 million in exemptions, and this is probably an undercount. I thought federal numbers on church tax exemptions would be easy to find, but it turns out there's no reliable system of accountability in place. A 2012 study from University of Tampa found that taxpayers are subsidizing about $71 billion a year in church exemptions, but that is also an undercount by many billions of dollars. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I'm sure there's going to be an adherent of the Catholic Church who turns around and tells me that I'm using biased, liberal, evil numbers, and that I'm just trying to slander the Catholic Church. So I want to remind everybody that Maria Bartiromo on Fox Business News cited the same study as a fact in this story, in which they too said 71 billion per year back in 2012, which is an undercount. And then they cited a separate report from the Washington Post the following year, which would have been 2013, that religious groups get around 83.5 billion a year in subsidies. Quote, adjusting for inflation and removing things like Bush-era faith-based initiatives funding from the equation, my own best guess would be around 100 billion per year, Michael Montgomery said. He's the owner of a consulting company that frequently goes on Fox Business as a guest. So now we're all caught up. The church gets more than 100 billion a year in tax exemptions. They received $1.5 billion in PPP loans, and they haven't paid a schmeckel of tax since the 1800s, okay? Now we're caught up. Now we're going to talk about just how bad this shit got, because this is what happens when you get people and you give them open access to organizations with a shit ton of money and very limited oversight. Keeping in mind that money paid out to people, to actual members of the working class, that shit is regulated with a fine-tooth comb. And there are 400 agencies who track that. But large funds that businesses and industries can just draw out of, that becomes a murky mystery real quick. Just want to make sure we're on the same page with the double standard. Now, as the year went on, the numbers kept growing. This number here actually confirmed by Pat Markey, the executive director of the Diocesan Financial Management Conference, which is an association of finance officers from Catholic dioceses, estimated that around 6,000 parishes had their applications for federal funding approved in the first round of PPP, and another 3,000 in the second round. That was in May. 9,000 churches got free money from the government in easily repayable loans, supposedly to keep their employees on the payroll. I understand there was a purpose to this, and I'm definitely not pooping on all these small individual churches. A lot of what we're talking about here is, again, the large-scale fraud that easily grows out of having large institutions with very few checks and balances. Now, in August, a local ABC news station down in Texas finished up a large investigation that they had been doing since the PPP loans started. There were at least 174 Catholic nonprofits that received loans estimated to save, quote, 8,583 jobs, according to the church-affiliated groups. Now, also in this story, they cite a Newsweek report that 88,000 churches nationwide received $7.3 billion in PPP loans. See, the number keeps going up the more quarterly reports are filed and actual journalists do the work of combing through it all and putting all the data together. Keeping in mind, again, that data is sporadic and scattered on purpose. And now we get to the big nasty. Joel Osteen, everybody's favorite mega preacher. You remember him. He was the guy who left people outside of his church in the middle of a hurricane in Houston to be battered by the weather because he didn't want his gorgeous megachurch getting any more water damage or exposing it to the poors who might be needy. Because, that's not how mega preachers work. By the way, nice Gulfstream there, Joel. The federal government can't take our money and give it to Joel Osteen or Robert Jeffries or Paula White, even in the wake of a pandemic, I wrote back in May. But that is exactly what Trump's Small Business Administration has done by giving PPP funds to churches. Paula White's church took in between $150,000 and $350,000. Jeffries' church grabbed between $2 and $5 million. And now we know that Osteen's megachurch pocketed $4.4 million. As time passes, the inevitable abuses are coming to light. One megachurch televangelist even bought a private jet. None of this should have happened. I'm going to once again interject and point out that this is indeed what was always going to happen, because you put a large fund and then opened up the Bombay doors and went, hey people, here's a fund of cash. No, you didn't want to have to do the hard work of allocating it based on need, because that would require effort and a lot of work at legislation, and it would take you off the campaign trail and limit the amount of time you can spend in the dialer room calling people for donations 7 days a week while you're in DC. Yes, lawmakers, I get it. It's much easier to just set up the fund and then tell all your friends how to exploit it. The CARES Act extended eligibility for loans from the Small Business Administration to nonprofits, something new, but the law did not give the SBA the power to extend this eligibility to churches. Nor could it, because the Constitution prohibits government funding of religion. In fact, the CARES Act only mentions religion once, to prevent universities from using taxpayer funds for capital outlays associated with facilities related to athletics or religious instruction. However, the SBA ignored that language, along with the century-old bar on taxpayer-funded religious worship, and instead issued rules and guidance declaring that the forgivable loans distributed under the CARES Act can be used to pay the salaries of ministers and other staff engaged in the religious mission of institutions. To do this, the SBA had to suspend numerous rules that correctly prevented taxpayer funds from flowing to churches. We've now been in Corona hell for so long, I think some of us have forgotten that back in the spring leading into the summer, when there was a large pile of money and everybody was desperate and they finally announced that they were getting $1,200 checks, literally tens of millions of people went, woo! And stopped paying attention to the grift going on around them because they were like, oh, wow, I can actually get some extended unemployment. I'm going to get a check. Oh, thank Lord. I'm safe. Check out. The SBA's constitutional violation, if such violations are to be measured in economic terms, is massive. American churches took in as much as $10 billion in taxpayer funds through the PPP loans. More than 400 evangelical churches received loans of at least $1 million. The Catholic Church might have taken in as much as $3.5 billion. Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church is probably the biggest church in the United States, with 50,000 or so members. One estimate puts its annual budget at $90 million, with more than $25 million going to their television ministry. Osteen's net worth is hard to pin down, but it's probably around 50 or 60 million. This isn't a church that's hard up for cash, and with sensible Americans worshiping at home, its massive televangelism empire probably only grew. The church claimed that it used its $4.4 million in taxpayer funds to, quote, provide full salaries and benefits, including health insurance coverage, to all its employees and their families. Well, that certainly sounds benevolent and Christ-like, doesn't it? You took money from millions of people, i.e. tax dollars, and then you gave it specifically to your congregation and adherents. Okay, sure, I'll overlook that because technically it's in the middle of a pandemic and you're ensuring that the people who work with you still have a job. You know, even though you're worth like 50 million and literally could pay them out of pocket anyway, and so could your ministry because your ministry is hundreds of millions of dollars. But of course, I know it's easier to take everybody else's money to pay your bills. This is a common reoccurring theme amongst capitalists who have now acquired a lot of capital. You know, they got all that capital by using other people's money. Also, just a quick reminder here, that's Joel Osteen's house. Doesn't pay taxes. So now, let me bring it all home to you. After all those stories, seeing all those numbers going up and up and up, every single story, and just how much money these churches got in the easily forgivable PPP loans that only required that you use the money to pay your employees. Well, President Trump did what President Trump does best, and he snuck in the back door and he made sure to fuck everybody just so the very few could further enrich themselves. Today, the Small Business Administration published a new Paycheck Protection Program regulation that once again particularly benefits churches. Under this regulation, SBA will forgive business loans of $50,000 or less, even if those businesses ignored PPP loan forgiveness stipulations and fired workers. No, it's okay, you don't have to pay the money back even though you fired your employees, because the money wasn't actually to help the working class, it was to help you, the capitalist who owns a business. So it's cool, don't worry about it. For small businesses that are affiliated with larger entities, this exemption applies to up to $2 million. So all of those companies and corporations that split themselves up to get maximum amount of PPP loans, yeah, they can all fire their employees and not have to worry about paying the loans back either. It's almost like it wasn't a loan. But even better than corporations and companies, Catholic Church came out the winner. Quote, affiliated houses of worship are not capped at $2 million. As a result, substantially larger religious organizations with many small affiliates will be able to take government funding and receive loan forgiveness, even if they violate the one requirement of the program, not firing workers. So there you go. Nearly $10 billion goes to the church under the auspices of paying employees. Every single one of the ministers questioned said, oh, our ministry took out the loan so we could pay our employees. No, not to pay for this Gulfstream jet or our television program. No, we took out the loan to pay our workers because that's why the Trump administration gave us the money. Oh, he canceled that part. Oh. So just remember, everybody, when you hear about the benevolence of government in large-scale hierarchical organizations, there's a really good chance that they're already putting in loopholes that they can start pushing people out through the second you're not looking. My name is James. I'm from the internet, and I'm out. Peace.